Good evening. Welcome to the Calm Has Brought Disquiet, the closing session for the symposium Dangkal Merantau and We Wonder Once Again. Over the last two evenings, eminent thinkers, writers, and practitioners such as Goenawan Mohamad, Terence Ward, Idana Pucci, Alan Entliff, and Choi Ka-Fai have led us on complex journeys into the multiple incarnations of the wanderer in history, particularly alluding to the diversity and depth of sources, especially within Asian cultural and philosophical thinking. If you did not manage to join us then, recordings of these sessions are available on our Facebook and YouTube. In today's session, we will discuss the act of wandering itself as a vision and method for uncovering new ways of thinking and working. Merantau as a fruitful passage for knowledge production and generation of new values. We are very privileged to have with us in this cozy discussion writers, thinkers, some who have been a part of the various stages of the Latiff Mohidin Pago Pago exhibition. I'm Erica Lai from Curator Programs at the Gallery, and co-moderating with me tonight is Curator Chin Yi Lim. She is part of the curatorial team for this exhibition. Over to you, Chin Yi.
Good evening. Hope everybody's having a good had your dinner for tonight. We're in for a very interesting discussion, and together with us, we have a whole group of very illustrious writers, speakers, dramaturgs, playwrights, and curators. So without further ado, please allow me to introduce some of the speakers that will be speaking tonight. Pauline Fan is a writer and literary translator. Her translations from German to Malay include works by Brecht, Immanuel Kant, Paul Celan. Her English translation of poems by Sarat poet Kula Grassi, Tell Me Kanyalan, Circumference Books to 2019 was longlisted for the Best Translated Books Award in 2020 and the 2020 National Translation Award in Poetry. We also have with us Eddin Khoo, who is a poet, writer, translator, and journalist. He is the founder of PUSAKA, one of the region's leading cultural centers. He has worked intimately with masters of traditional arts, including shadow puppeteers, musicians, dramatists, and dancers, researching oral transmission, cultural and religious politics, and aspects of ritual in traditional theatre. Next up, we also have Nasri Shah with us, who is curator at the Malay Heritage Centre in Singapore, where he conducts research and works on exhibitions and community engagement. Nasri's past projects include Women in Action 2018, Mereka Utusan, Imprinting Malay Modernity in 2016. We also have Alfian Sa'at, who is a writer, poet, and resident playwright of Wild Rise. His published works include 3 collections of poetry, One Fierce Hour, a history of amnesia, and The Invisible Manuscript, a collection of short stories. In 2001, Alfian won the Golden Point Award for Poetry as well as National Arts Council's Young Artist Award for Literature. Nabilah Said is also with us tonight. She is a Singapore-based playwright, editor, theatre critic, and poet. Her plays have been presented in Singapore and London, including dark comedy Inside Voices, which won the Origins Award for Outstanding New Work at London Vault Festival 2019. So without further ado, can we please invite them to our screen tonight. Hi, everybody.
Hello.
Hi.
Hi.
Hi, welcome.
Hello.
Welcome. Yeah.
Okay, shall we just perhaps begin this whole discussion by speaking a bit about wandering within the Minangkabau culture, the term merantau. Would any one of you like to share about, merantau in terms of practice or philosophy? Perhaps Nasri would like to start.
Yeah.
I think, I'm not the only sort of qualified person to speak on it, but I will start. The practice of merantau is largely sort of ascribed to the Minangkabau community, come from Sumatra. And we've understood the practice of merantau to be sort of a rite of passage, particularly for a lot of young men from Minangkabau who, because of the matrilineal culture that they have there, are sort of encouraged to seek knowledge, wealth opportunities in shores that are sort of beyond their immediate homeland. But as we pointed out previously, the practice of merantau is not very much exclusive to the Minangkabau. So you see variants of this kind of a journey or this kind of wandering, as it were, in a lot of other communities in the Malay world, like the Banja, for instance, for which it's known as Madam, the Iban groups, for example, but also in a lot of other groups. And there are sort of variants, I guess, cultural or ethnological variants as to the reasons why they journey. But I think what's interesting for us to sort of consider, at least for me, for someone who works at the Malay Heritage Centre, is how merantau is sort of situated, or what it says about our conception of space, of cultural knowledge, our relations to one another, and things like that. So I'll stop it there, and then maybe someone else wants to add on, before we sort of go further into the rabbit hole.
Maybe I could add on from Nasri's point. I think so much of merantau is defined really by geography, and the region of Southeast Asia being dominated by the sea, and essentially Southeast Asian culture very essentially being part of a seafaring tradition, a seafaring culture. The Malays, in all their varieties, have long been known as nomadic sea gypsies in search of fortune and trade. Important also to understand the certain kind of metaphysics associated with various genders. We understand in Southeast Asia, for example, that we are defined essentially by a very matrilineal culture in the sense that women are believed to be better with money, better administrators overall, the seats of power and authority, while men essentially are fools and artists and suffer from a kind of existential restlessness, which is best defined by this act of wandering. I think another very palpable aspect of wandering that is hugely interesting is, of course, the lack of any sense of borders. The border culture is a very recent phenomenon, a very modern phenomenon, and this idea essentially of crossing terrains in search of fortune, and fortune is a very generic term here, has been practiced for centuries and centuries. But I still think essentially that wandering is located in that metaphysical difference between the male and the female that I think is a very important aspect and very defining aspect of Southeast Asian culture as a whole.
Yeah, I'd just like to add.
To bring back please
Sure.
go ahead,
Pauline.
I just want to add something to that, is that in other parts of the peninsula where we work, also in the north, in places like Kelantan, for example, the idea of, it's not so much merantau, but it's this idea of journeying, and this idea of it's very embedded in the folklore. And so in PUSAKA, with some of the traditions that we work with, like the Mak Yong tradition, for example, or the Wayang Kulit, Main Putri, and Manora, all of those traditions have a very specific, even music that goes with the lagu berjalan. So the journey from one place to another, and metaphysically from one state to another, is always accompanied by this lagu berjalan. And it is that transition of not just the physical, this one space to another, but it is really a metaphysical journey. And many of those folklores have, just say the Cerita Mak Yong, for example. If you look at the Dewa Muda, and also Dewa Pecil, but Dewa Muda, the entire story much of what is happening is his journey between Bumi and Kayangan. And so it's not just even a journey from one physical earthly place to another. It's also very much a journey from one from the earthly to the ethereal and to the sublime. And those kinds of journeys are also part, I think, of the larger merantau that we are talking about.
Yeah, just to also bring back to also Latiff, because like when he mentioned about merantau, it's also something of a voluntary leaving of one's home and the familiar. But I think like Alfian, you spoke about it at some point that it also means that it's not a diasporic journey, but there is a return.
Yep. Yes.
It's
So
like merantau.
that's right. So with merantau, there's that sense of wandering, but it's also circular migration, right? So there's always the idea that you are going to return home, and in fact, there's the idea that you are always going to be a guest. You're going to rely on other people's hospitality. And it's not about making a permanent settlement somewhere else, and therefore we find like a lot of pantun, a lot of proverb that gives advice to people what to do in what is called the rantau orang. So it means other people's territories, other people's places. Yeah. So maybe I'll read like a couple of pantun that where you can find these sentiments expressed. So this one says pisang kelat di gonggong halang, jatuh sebiji ke Indragiri. So there's a banana that's being carried by an eagle, and one of it is fallen on this place called Indragiri. Kalau pergi ke rantau orang, baik-baik membawa diri. So that's the piece of advice. When you are rantauing in other people's territories, you have to behave yourself. And actually, there's this proverb where they tell you exactly how to behave. And this proverb says, masuk ke kampung orang, bawa ayam betina. So you're told to bring a hen. Don't bring a rooster. The rooster is going to start crowing. Okay? And then jalan di tepi-tepi. So you have to walk by the side of the paths. Don't walk in the center. Benang arang orang jangan dipijak. So don't step on the charcoal thread. So it's a thread that's used to mark measurements on wood. Duduk di tapak tangga, which is you have to sit on the foot of the stairs. You don't sit on the steps itself. Mandi di hilir orang, meaning that you bathe downstream. You don't bathe upstream and wash your dirt down to other people. And then berdiri di luar gelanggang. So always stand outside, let's say, the arena or the public space. So let's say there's cockfighting, whatever. Always be on the periphery. So the advice is somehow to be very deferential to your hosts, to sort of always, maybe there's something Asian going on there, right? That Asians, we are very good at folding ourselves into our own personal space and not infringing on other people's. But I think, yeah, so this is an example of this pantun as well as a peribahasa or proverb, which talks about the values about merantau. So as you mentioned, it is circular migration. So I think as an artist, if you are embarking on that kind of a journey, it's not really exile. It's not really, you're not mourning the loss of your homeland, for example. There's always a sense that you're carrying part of it with you, which is expressed in this one last pantun. They're very short, right? It's just 4 lines. So this pantun says, terayap-rayap si anak kumbang, hinggap di atas tersangkut, hinggap di atap tersangkut duri. So the little beetle is flying around and wandering and straying, and then it's gone on the atap roof and it's got hooked or caught on the thorns. Berapa sedap di rantau orang, manakan sama desa sendiri. So however pleasurable, however enjoyable life is in other people's territories, other people's lands, you cannot compare with your own village or your own hometown.
So just to catch on that, on furthermore, like investigating on this framing of the merantau, it's also whether the experience of the merantau, given that it dwells very much on hospitality, there is a kind of informality and unstructured knowledge production that's also entailed with it. Am I right?
Oh, yeah, of course. So I think your fortunes when you merantau really does depend on your character, your personality, your emotional quotient. I cannot imagine some people with very low EQ doing very well when they merantau. right? There are all these relationships, obviously, that you have to cultivate, because you're right, it's not based on quite formal structures of like staying in a hotel. You are depending a lot, as Blanche Dubois says, on the kindness of strangers. So, and of course, distant relatives and also kin. But definitely, you have to have a certain kind of predisposition to do that. Yeah.
Yeah. Because that also like brings us to one of the next questions that we want to talk about, which is the experience of the space and time. Latiff very much also spoke about how like Pago Pago series, like going back to the series of works that are very key to this exhibition itself. Is that how Pago Pago is an encounter with time in multiple cities. And to make of time what one chooses, we try to exceed time because we often assume that that is progressive and linear. But there is always regression, or perhaps time to just go in a series of cycles. Move forward is also to move backwards. So I'm also thinking in terms of this experience of merantauing. Well, I'm butchering the term here, but also like thinking about multiple city in terms of like what happened back in the days of like the 60s, where like Latiff was also like working through his time in Berlin and how he traveled through Southeast Asia itself, and coming back to like us right now, like in terms of our practice before and in the last couple of years, and also under the current circumstances. So I like to kind of understand like how you would actually envision what it is to experience this moment like on your own. Like what does it mean right now to think of wandering?
Maybe I can jump in.
Sure.
So it's interesting when you are saying like Latiff Mohidin like traveled into all these countries, because I find that we are always trying to map where he's been and where he went, and that comes with like having like a retrospective kind of exhibition, of course. But I've also heard about how like people say that you can't quite place him, or sometimes you can't quite find him. Can you hear me?
Yeah,
We
there was a
lost
bit
you.
of yeah.
Okay. Yeah, so like you sometimes you can't quite place him, or you can't quite find him, even though we try to place him on the map in some way. And I find that like I resonate with that at this point in time, where we can't travel, right? So we can't traverse space, for example. And then with time, like time is so kind of expanded and distended and kind of distorted during this time as well. So I find myself thinking more about space time. So like the idea of like time traveling and the possibilities of time travel, and how that can actually be quite a freeing thought during this time when we're trying to find solutions, whether we can think of it as speculative journeying through time. Yeah.
I'm also thinking about space because like one of the very interesting essays that has come out of our of the National Gallery's blog, which is written by Bani Haikal. He actually wrote about how this collapse of space between offline and online actually was very disruptive to off work and while working, was very disruptive to like his daughter, because the daughter could not recognize like the difference when they were like working and when they wouldn't. And I just want to like really push it out to you as well, because like many of you are obviously like we write in different capacities, have different structures of employment or labor, and whether if you would, how would you think about like such collapse of space, for example, given the restriction that has happened? Sorry, you can hear my cat, right? Would somebody like to respond to that? Like, how would it feel to be restricted? Like, yeah.
Yeah, I suppose one of the things that I'm thinking of as we were preparing for this particular talk, when we're talking about wandering and merantau, right, is whether wandering is ever possible, or did Latiff during his time, did he ever conceive of, say, forms of wandering which were not tied in with actual movements of the physical body, right? So, for example, right now, Pauline and Eddin are based in Malaysia right now. So this is actually an interesting transnational forum that we're having. Not to say that we could not have done this, before pandemic or whatever, but I think we've all really become acclimatized and quite acculturated to these particular interfaces, and we've sort of had to learn in response to the crisis, right? But I would say there's definitely this idea of the melting of boundaries between, as you mentioned, the private and the public. But I think also interestingly, and hopefully something to our advantage, is that, so when I talk about Merantau, we're also talking about the friction of the terrain. And I feel that sometimes when we are doing stuff virtually, then some of that friction we don't have to encounter anymore, right? We don't have to commute. We just dial in, and then we just see all these interesting faces pop up on our screens, and we're able to have our encounters and meetings, etc. So I think for me, it's interesting that, so Nabilah has talked about time dilating, compressing, and I feel that's happening with space as well, right? So a lot of my friends who are really very far away, suddenly I'm beginning to sense this idea of these remote intimacies and these virtual mobilities. Uh, Although maybe someone can say, "Oh, I'm just consoling myself. This is just self-deception as a coping mechanism." But it is true. I find myself like keeping in touch with people who are otherwise like, yeah, really very far away, because I'm getting the sense that they are actually just a computer call away. So I didn't really have this kind of imagination beforehand. Mm.
Alfian, my lovely friend, I think you're deceiving yourself. There's an act of self-deception. I don't know. This collapse of space. I mean, one of the concepts of Marantau, in the sense that we are talking about it, is the tactile, is the actual interaction with nature, with the trees, with walls, with white plaster, which is very obvious in Latiff. Um, I am finding this whole experience of collapsing of space quite paradoxical, because on the one hand, it's very agreeable, uh, given that I'm extremely misanthropic. So this whole need to confine yourself to a certain kind of remoteness is really wonderful. But on the other hand, you need to touch people. Literally need to touch and hold people. And as you can see, I'm totally a techno moron, so I can't even set this thing up, and I need somebody to do it for me. And what I'm beginning to discover is that I'm willfully refusing to participate, as in, willfully not wanting to learn how to do this, because it kind of would alter my reality somehow. So I think the concept of wandering within the midst of an environment that is tactile is very important. I think there's mind travel that we can do. They do it in the Mak Yong all the time. They do it in the Wayang all the time, climbing to Kayangan and everything. But they are enveloped and surrounded essentially by wind and air and trees and leaves. And I think it is this aspect that is hugely crucial to us understanding the concept of Merantau. And remember, Merantau also is very rooted in an existential state of being, existential disposition, which is the concept of resah. And if you go back to Latiff's poem there, "The Calm Has Brought the Storm," you will find that this quest of having an existential restlessness is one of the main impetus for this idea of wandering or merantau, which really cannot be defined. As much as we talk about it, it's still not something that can be defined, explained perhaps, extrapolated and talked about, but defined, very difficult.
Yeah. I mean, I have to agree, Eddin. I have to, in spite of being sort of like my sales pitch earlier, right? But I am really sort of wondering, like, for example, when Pak Latiff was going through, journeying through, let's say, the ruins in Angkor Wat, for example, I think the experience of time there is not something you can transmit, let's say, in a photograph or in a video. I am quite convinced of that. I think that there needs to be the co-presence with whatever is there, whether it's the banyan trees that's completely slowly vegetally consuming or overwhelming the ruins, which he himself, has transformed into some paintings, right? But I think that experience definitely of the multiple temporalities, I think one needs to be there. That one needs to be present in time. Yeah. So I definitely do agree with that. I'm just trying to be a cheerleader for for the crisis. Yep.
I do agree, actually, in the sense that though on one sense Merantau could be seen as lateral, but there's also a layering of memories or of histories, perhaps, in one's experience of Merantau, which I think, to Curator's credit, they did really well by introducing text and video, and so it becomes an intermedia experience. And I think the text, the poetry, really sort of illustrates that multiplicity in one moment of this different sort of being. There's that emotional proximity, even though you're confined in one place, which is really interesting, I guess, for me.
I just wanted to add.
Yeah.
Just wanted to add, we're talking about Latiff, and I think his what was very defining in his work also. And of course, I do agree with Nabilah that some of his work is can't really be placed specifically to German expressionism or anything like that. But at the same time, I do think that the German experience for him was very defining and shaped profoundly who he was, both as an artist, as a visual artist, and as a poet. And I think it's not so much that he just resonated with certain styles. I think he also actively took on that role of the wanderer in the German tradition, and that's a tradition, that's a theme and a motive that has actually, it's one of the dominant themes of German literature and art and music as well, since Goethe's time, which was a kind of counter-Enlightenment movement, actually, that Sturm und Drang period, the storm and stress period of the young Goethe, in which this idea of der Wanderer became really, really heightened as the romantic figure who was challenging rationalism, this kind of what the Enlightenment philosophy brought, which was really a rationalist view and understanding of the world, that they were really countering that and going deep into the individual self and saying that the artist is the one who really understands most everything about the world and about nature. And it's not, it's the opposite of Kant, yeah? So, and I think Latiff took on that role as well. And so there's that whole line from Goethe to down to Rilke, down to even the modernists like Hermann Hesse, of course, and even down to the figure of, the more destructive periods of German history, the Nazi Zeit, of course, where you had these very isolated beings and the intellectual and the artist became isolated and did this, what they call the inner immigration, yeah? So this kind of innere Einwanderung that they talk about. That is still another manifestation of the figure of the wanderer. And I think Latiff kind of definitely, his idea and what he brought with him through the Merantau also quite naturally absorbed that figure of the wanderer and as artist, I think.
Latiff and Germany simply cannot be torn apart. What Latiff brought with him in terms of origins and a cultural genesis really received a philosophical construction was built in his time in Germany. He would never have become a poet if he had chosen to study art in Britain. we know how he became a poet. He was fit with fever, and he read Rimbaud and he read Baudelaire, and it resonated. And of course, right there in Germany, you have not not just these wanderers, but really Holderlin, very dramatic figures. Holderlin, who walked towards his madness for 40 days and 40 nights or whatever, and confined himself in the tower. So I think, I think Europe gave Latiff Mohidin philosophical foundations, which he already had. And it almost kind of vindicated, I think, his sense of being a constant seeker, of exploring really with form and language. A lot of that, I think, was gained from his experience in Europe, and till today. I mean, on a personal level, he constantly falls back on those references because I think they are the blood and brine of what essentially was an instinctive, soul-based, exchange with the world. Eventually took on really powerful kind of vocabulary and diction with his encounter with Europe.
If I can just
Eddin,
jump in, though. Yeah, sorry,
go ahead.
Chingy.
Go ahead. Oh,
Yeah. So
Eddin. So, go ahead,
Sorry,
Alfian.
Alfian. Yeah.
we're
Too
doing
many people.
the online ping pong thing. No, I just wanted to just jump in and as much as I kind of like appreciate this particular characterization of Latiff as the romantic artist, but I also have some questions regarding some of the burdens that he must have felt, for example, as, let's say, number one, a child prodigy, right, who was famous very young, I think 11 years old, won art competition. And then also the fact that he was on a scholarship. So this idea of the artist from the developing country going to somewhere in the metropole and then expected to, bring back learning, etc., back to his home country. So I think that's also that other aspect of Merantau we should attend to, which is that it's not just feckless wandering. You are supposed to accumulate resources, etc., which you have to share when you get back home. Yeah, so that's a part of, I think, Latiff's journey. We should also pay some attention to, because I think it's easy to kind of like romanticize and mystify the artist, but being a human being with all these particular social obligations, I'm sure, he had all these things, working on his mind as well.
Yeah, I think one of the wonderful things about him, and I take Alfian's point. It's a very good point to make, actually, because this was a particular generation, a formative generation, who basically had this experience at the given the generosity. Given the generosity of the developed world, what I find very amazing about Latiff and his counterpart Ibrahim Hussein, both were on scholarships and so on, was that I think they were serious rebels because they had all this imposed upon them. They were expected to do all of these things, come back, and they didn't care. They continued to wonder. They continued to be completely irresponsible with their responsibilities. And unlike many of the other generation, for example, Syed Ahmad Jamal, people like this who went on the same kind of bequest, they returned and they set up institutes and the teaching profession, teaching art. Latiff Mohidin came back and formed Ana Alam, a commune right in the middle of Kuala Lumpur. Yeah, Ibrahim Hussein pretty much did the same thing. He traveled to Mexico, he traveled to New York, and Ibrahim Hussein always says that among that generation, Latiff and himself were fortunate enough to have a lucky star. In the sense that they seem to get away with not paying back their obligations in ways that others of their generation didn't do. But I think that's we don't want to romanticize, but I think the wonderful thing about a person like Latiff is I think he romanticizes himself. And he did romanticize himself for a very long time. In more recent years, he has become a very, I think, astute manager of his work, and that side of looking after the practicalities has become very real and concrete. But I think the romance that we have of him may partly be imposed, but I think it was also very much inspired because he was really somebody who chose to do as he wished, despite being chained by these financial obligations and obligations of scholarships and so on. I don't know of any institute that he taught in, or no, none. He has remained pretty free all of these decades.
Eddin, if I could also get you to comment on this part. So Ismail Zain actually once mentioned that, Pak Latif had a vernacular cosmopolitanism. So, but then he still appeared like he never left Seremban. So how do you think he's processed this duality?
I think it's worked with him. It's fallen very well. I think the Malay essentially is innately very cosmopolitan, very dunyawi, very worldly, because the culture is so fluid in the first place. So I think these questions of one thing I also find very attractive about a person like Latif. Some argue that Ibrahim Hussein, for example, was very Western, but Ismail Zain's characterization was really really quite perfect in the sense that he was able to straddle these worlds and fuse them and find a synergy within himself that was very, very compatible. I think this also comes from, I think, his disposition. His disposition is actually very quite settled and calm, and I think his sense of where he comes from is very real. There's very little dissension there about who he is authentically. Even Osman Awang, the poet, spoke about Pak Latif in that way. That somehow he has a very easy way of synergizing these two very different experiences. But if you get into his work seriously, if you start to translate him, for example, then you will find that these tensions are very, very apparent. Yeah, not a clash necessarily, but a certain kind of tension between what he picks up in terms of poetic form, for example, as compared to in tension with the kind of poetic spirit that he tries to compel. He is in form a very German poet. It's impossible to translate Latiff Mohidin if you do not know Rilke and Truckle and that entire generation of German poets. Impossible. People have tried. People from a very English poetry background have tried to translate him, and the translations, I must say, have been very, very poor. But you have to come from that Germanic modernist, Dutch modernist, French modernist tradition to be able to really capture him faithfully. Shinyi, I can't hear you.
Sorry, I mute myself. But there's also the syncretism that's like happening, right? That is part and parcel of merantau, and that we talk about knowledge accumulation, knowledge production in a more informal sense of the word. Here, I want to also like bring it back to the present day. That we talk about knowledge production. Over there, Alfian has also spoken about remote intimacies and how we start to gain knowledge around here. And I was just wondering, because like the difference between like Latif's time and what we are experiencing today, there is the question of technology itself. Like, what is the language of technology that would have conditioned our knowledge production and our wanderings these days? And I was just wondering, like, what would be like some of the structures that we would speak about and that still can pervade through the current days? Yeah.
So
Informal structures.
Sure.
Yeah, go ahead.
I just wanted to say that I think even before like Zooming and all this, budget flights have allowed a lot of us ease of merantauing within the region. So I'm definitely one of those people who like, now it's not so expensive to take flights all around. But what I noticed was that because flights were kind of cheap, then you didn't feel like you needed to stay long in one place. You just fly there and then fly back. Whereas I think previously, when flights were a lot more expensive, there was more a sense of, okay, maybe I should try to make this an overland journey over various countries, for example. So that idea of roaming, I think perhaps was more comprehensive, maybe. Not to say that you can't plan like longer journeys, etc. But I must say the convenience has, for me at least, spoiled me quite a bit. That I can do,
Yes.
just a weekend trip, not linger too long, not really
Yeah.
bother about, hey, what's next door, what's the country there, so more targeted forms of tourism and journeying, but also I suppose, not as deep, and
Yeah, that's
engaged.
definitely true. That's even when we travel the peninsula to do our field work with PUSAKA. We really prefer not to fly, even though it's so much easier to fly 1 hour from KL to Kota Baru. We would rather take that 8-hour drive because you need to. It's the process of getting there, the landscape, immersing yourself in the landscape. Your thoughts start to change. Your language starts to change. You start to speak Bahasa Kelate, Kecik Kelate. It's all that, and the sounds and the rhythm of everything changes. And I think it's a different experience. And then when you arrive, you are really embraced by that landscape and the logat and everything. It is a much different experience. Whereas when we fly, and sometimes we do have to fly, but it's really not enjoyable at all. And I always feel like something's missing.
Nabilah, you also spoke at one point about the observer effect, like, in certain spaces, like intimate spaces, like theater, and how, like, that has like sort of also changed, in current times itself. Do you want to talk more about that? You're mute.
Can't hear you, Nabilah.
Sorry. Yeah, it was partially because I was frustrated with not having answers, like as an artist, that I started looking at science for some reason, and physics and like quantum physics type things, which is really weird because in Singapore you're often like forced to choose like either arts or science, right? And during this time, I've like the freedom to kind of traverse both. So I really resonated with something called the observer effect by, I think, Heisenberg, where the more you observe a phenomenon, the more it changes, right? And to me, that was super resonant because I here am trying to reflect a lot about what's happening with us, today. But the moment I observe it, I change it, or I change, and my world around me changes. And then with the pandemic, of course, like conditions change all the time. So I was just trying to think of that in relation to how we're trying to live our lives. But if I can kind of respond to the remote intimacies that Alfian was talking about earlier, I was thinking about how the language of intimacy has changed, and it's become like the actual language, the actual alphabets of the language have become ones and zeros, right? Because essentially all this programming code that is allowing us to connect through Zoom or through the internet. But now we can connect through Excel sheet. So, like as an example, there's a mutual aid solidarity movement happening in Singapore where people are listing, if people who really need financial help and can't get it from the government, they list their needs on a spreadsheet. And this spreadsheet is open access, so anyone can look at it, and then you can go and decide to help someone who is essentially a stranger, right? You see their name in an Excel sheet. It could be anyone, but you are choosing to trust this Excel sheet. You're choosing to trust this document. You're choosing to trust in a kind of like programming language that's been used, and that's an intimacy which I never thought about before. Intimacy through spreadsheet, Yeah, so just a different kind of intimacies that are coming up, I suppose, and Zoom is another one as well.
Yeah, but also like thinking about like the different generations and with regards to dealing with such limited mobility or virtual mobilities in that sense. Pauline, you spoke on in some point about your community work as well with in Sarawak, and how like some of the traditions actually allow them to actually push through this period of time. Yeah.
Absolutely. Yeah, in a lot of the communities that we work with in Pusaka, there are traditional communities that practice ritual arts. And some of those ritual art, many of them are actually also under the pressure of state governments. And like they have fatwas on them, like the Kuda Kepang tradition in Johor, most of the traditions in Kelantan, which have been prescribed for the past almost 30 years. But many of those traditions are ritual and they involve for lack of a better word, trance. I mean, that's the kind of English overall term, but the communities themselves have many different ways of describing this experience. And they differ from community to community. And even within a particular tradition, there's many kinds of trance. There's mabuk, there's lupa, there's all kinds of different states of being that they fall into. And I think there is, before the advent of the kind of technology we're thinking about, I think people who were more rooted in one space and more connected to a particular community and to a particular tradition, not all, but some of them do have, especially in the oral traditions and through an experience of orality, which is much more intense than the kind of, the way we experience the world. Even we who study it can't access those kinds of experiences because it's a really different way of experiencing the world where you can shift very quickly from the experience of your physical surroundings and the everyday relationships that are around you to a metaphysical and mythological understanding of the world, and it's not that separated within the mind and the body of those of the oral person, and it's not something. It's not a romanticization of them. It's actually just a different experience, and I think it's something. There's a kind of lament sometimes in the work that we do because when we see these ways changing or disappearing, it's not always on an organic way. You know, it's happening because of political, cultural, and political pressures that are happening. And so we do try to document a lot of that stuff. But I think that is a way, and I think it happens not only in the larger Malay Nusantara communities. I think even the diasporic communities, like the Chinese community and the Indian community, of course, they have those traditions as well, and the Dayak communities as well of Sarawak, for sure. But that is a different realm of experience and of traveling and of merantau and transcendence of the self.
Yeah, but this is also like about the multiplication of time.
Yeah,
that like
absolutely.
the multiplicity of time that Latiff also speaks about, like when he's like drawing on the pago, like how like traditions as well as like contemporary culture comes into play and how they actually can build up this whole syncretism that happens. Now I'm kind of interested to like understand perhaps a question posed to all of you as well as to like what would be seen as like new strategies for the future, like in your work, in your practice, and what you would like to see happen.
People are very sanguine and optimistic. What we are doing now, I'm sorry, I need a lot of convincing to tell me that this is a fluid way of communicating. I really need a lot of convincing because we want to build these virtual structures to replace our ability to sit, right opposite each other and touch each other's faces. It's not going to happen. This is just a necessity. This is an excuse for my work, for our work in PUSAKA. It's been devastating. The inability to reach out to real communities. And when we talk about intimacies, you don't get any more intimate than ritual theater, where you need music, where you need theater, where you need passion plays, essentially, literally to make you well. Yeah. So this period has been very, very devastating because those intimacies are not consummated. Yeah. And there are already lots of our community within that traditional setting, that ritual setting, who are starting to feel low, starting to feel a degree of aggression, frustration, and so on. So fortunately, we are now able to at least travel and meet. But for now, on the other side of our work, which is the writing, the catching up on all the reading that needs to be done, it has been a particularly fortuitous period because there is that other metaphorical dimension to COVID, which is all about look, stop and take stock and think deeply and contemplate. And that has been the allowance of the past 3 to 5 months. But I'm still, I still have to wait for a time when we can return back to normal. I just refuse to accept the new normal. It's not a way to live, really isn't, and work too.
Yeah, I can
that's
speak a
why.
little bit about my experience. So on one hand, like what Pauline was saying, this experience of virtuality is it's not the domain of the digital. It's always been there through oral traditions and such. And so in some sense, that's kind of benefited this project that the Malay Heritage Centre is working on, which is the Nusantara series of exhibitions, and we will have one coming up in November, just a little plug, where we basically work with members of different communities to kind of present their heritage, as it were, Minang, Bugis, and so on. And this comprises, in the context of Singapore, members of the community, some of whom have, traveled and done their merantau from wherever it is they came from, but some of them who are actually second generation or third generation. And so what it means for them to revisit the tradition of merantau when it's not so much, for them, it's not so much coming from these places, but actually just the returning of these places because they were born in Singapore and then now they're revisiting these traditions. And the implication for us curatorially is that we don't have a lot of material culture necessarily to kind of show, to represent as part of these communities, because a lot of it has been lost or not inherited, or they traveled light, so they didn't bring, all their series and whatever. And so the one good thing is that this period, people have become a lot more accommodating of things which aren't physically there, So for the first time, we're like, yes, we can present all this intangible knowledge, and people will not accept the lesser for it because it's, because we don't have the physical things. So that's been one sort of plus point for us working on this way of this time. I completely agree that there are absolutely tangible effects to this. A lot of them are elderly, and they were very much restricted on a very real level by the social distancing measures. So just accessing them was a real sort of issue for us, and the lines of communication were definitely disrupted. So there are just sort of like two aspects to it, which is kind of interesting for us and also a bit worrying as we kind of look ahead and how we engage these communities. Yeah.
I think it's
So
kind
for
of,
me, yeah,
yeah.
go ahead.
Go on, Alfian. Sorry,
Yeah,
you're playing ping
just a very
pong
brief
again.
one. So talking about like what we can do in the future, in the very near future, which is next week. I have a plug, which is I'm assembling a group of theatre makers from the regions of Philippines and Thailand and Indonesia, Malaysia. We're gonna talk about what is a Southeast Asian theatre canon, and this is the kind of discussion that I wouldn't even think of having, because previously it would be about flying them down, accommodation, etc. So this for me is one of the plus points, and also being able to encounter some of their works on video, etc., where previously that was not possible. So for me personally, I do see more work in the region. I'm really quite inspired actually by Latiff's own paintings when he was traveling through Indochina, and I think just that kind of gazing on the Southeast Asia and trying to understand that it's not these stereotypical countries that were divided by the Cold War, not just this so-called Buddhist North and Muslim South, that it's a region of so much more complexity than that. So I'm looking forward to more regional exchanges actually. Yeah, personally.
So Nabila, you spoke about the mutual aid spreadsheet as a structure as well, and it's part of the Software Starts project. per se. And it's also like a way for them to like actually like move this language of care into like, you know, our contemporary society as a way of negotiating the different classes and the people who have fallen between the gaps that were not part of the social policies that have been like coming out so far. I'm just wondering, like as a provocation, because like in the midst of like the situation that we have seen so far, like, you know, Latiff has been in his past has been very adaptive in developing strategies of traveling, of escaping his financial responsibility, or even like knowledge production, and that was necessary for his artistic development, right? We would all agree on that. So something like, say, the mutual aid, or even the question of collapsing time and space, which Eddin has mentioned. You know, the virtual space is not a very convivial space for him. And how do we even? What would we see these structures, something like mutual aid or other structures, coming to be to move beyond the current pandemic situation?
I hate structures, so
yeah,
I mean, I think it's a time of paradox, right? So it's in reaction to a violence that's happening that you need like something that bypasses the violence and to care in a different way, and that comes with the whole idea of like radical caring, which is something that I've been kind of like involved in. I'm part of a group that's trying to do intimacy and care workshops for artists and practitioners. And before this, like it was all about production. It was all about creating work and, you know, being part of a grants framework or a production framework in the country, or, you know, just generally as an artist, right? And then during this time of pause, which is also a very privileged kind of idea, we are starting to think about care, which is something that I guess we should have been thinking about all along, but it's suddenly become like, hey, let's think about this thing. So to me, that's kind of like a positive, I suppose, but it only comes out because or in reaction to a violence that is imposed by, you know, a bigger thing and a bigger structure. So in response to you, I don't like creating new structures, but if these structures are resisting something else bigger than it, then yeah, sure. But they shouldn't be there the whole time, right? Because then that means that something is wrong, and we are always trying to resist or respond to something that isn't right. But I am an optimist, so I'm kind of like the opposite of Eddin.
We'll have to feed off each other then.
That's a good balance.
So I'm black and he's in white.
There we go.
Yeah. So I think we're down to 10 p.m. So shall we open to any questions?
Okay, let me see.
Or comments?
Yes. Okay. We have one question.
Can't see it. Sorry, Erica.
You can't see. Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. So Lucas is asking that there are many different ways to merantau, but he seems to be hearing that it's mainly men. So are there other examples? And he's looking for recent examples, more contemporary examples.
I think like the first part, like Eddin spoke about, like, you know, merantau as like part of the Minangkabau matrilineal society. So there was a very, like, Eddin very clearly like explained that there was obviously like a very fixed defined gender roles with regards to like who would wander and who would not. Are there any other examples?
You know, actually, with women, the act of wandering with women, and it's not just Minangkabau culture, yeah, it's basically a Southeast Asian sensibility and practice. And matrilineal cultures are spread throughout Southeast Asia. Though they may not be structured in a matrilineal way, they still have this very strong dominance of women and association with property. Merantau, when it applies to women, is always really quite tragic. So it's women who've been sent into exile or who have chosen to exile themselves, and who often come to sometimes very tragic ends. I think a very good example of this is the Pontianak, for example. A woman who has been cheated and basically forces herself into an exile, into her own death, after which she metamorphoses into something else. So it's quite interesting to see how Merantau applies to the male and the female and the particular kinds of contexts. More recent examples of Merantau, I think, are more adventuristic, and often. And now in this age of social media, it's a lot about, I think, quite a lot of exhibitionism about where I go and what I do and what I eat, kind of thing. But that doesn't become Merantau anymore, I think.
But just to follow up on that, would you even describe Merantau as a process that inherently requires a kind of knowledge production?
That phrase, knowledge production, scares me a great deal. I don't know what you mean by knowledge production. Do you mean knowledge production
Like
in
sort
the
of-
Benjamin sense, or knowledge production in the Soviet sense? I'm not sure. As in
More
how
like
foreign
gaining knowledge.
Sorry?
Nothing ideological behind it, but like just
Okay.
more like gaining knowledge as he goes by. Because like from the syncretism that happens with Latiff, also like because of his exposure to various cultures and reading and so on. And I think in expanding the notion of Merantau, what we try to do tonight was also like to talk about like the contemporary examples as well as like what happened in Latiff itself. So one of the things is I'm trying to question, like like you spoke about the very specific gender roles when it comes to who could Merantau and who could not Merantau due to the responsibilities within the society, correct? And here the question is, why were, other than, what was the tragicness? Why the Pontianak was seen as sort of a tragic figure in the Merantau?
Well, because she was forced out. It's a kind of expulsion. Sometimes not a forced expulsion. You get that sense of Merantau also. The other main Southeast Asian character who is cast into a state of wandering is Sita, Sita Devi, the wife of Rama. Who he believes that she has cheated on him, and she basically expels her, and then she ends up in this life of wandering. And what the allusion to that is also very interesting, because the moment the woman wanders, everything in the center starts to fall and crack and break. So there are two tragedies happening concurrently: the tragedy of the expulsion and the exile of the center of power, and then the actual fragmentation of that center of power itself, as a result of its main influence not being able to hold it together. In terms of knowledge production, I mean, there is very much this notion in Merantau of essentially knowledge being very associated with lived experience. Not just learned experience. My father, who was a professor of history, always said this, well-known professor of history, and he always talked about the need basically to get out of the classroom. My father was one of those, for example, who hated reading books. People kept giving him books, but he actually hated reading books. He preferred what he called the primacy of primary resources, letters and documents and treaties and maps. And I remember him being once asked, "What is the first source of history?" And he replied very seriously, but quite blithely, "The first source of history is gossip." and this idea of knowledge production as a result of lived experience, of observation, of being able to touch and feel and get into the center of a kind of throb of a social attitude or social prejudices. I think is very much perhaps what Latiff is also doing. Always remember also Pago Pago, we've not mentioned here, is very much an elegy. And that's where he basically interfaces with the current events of that time. Yeah, that the elegiac is the thing that basically runs through a lot of Pago Pago and those areas that he traveled during that particular time, from Thailand into Cambodia and Vientiane, Laos in particular. The most innocent of the victims of Indochina is Laos. And you find the Laotian journey, and especially elegiac one, and filled with a great deal of regret, pain, and pathos.
Can I just add?
Yeah.
I think like when it comes to like the merantau and the idea of the gendered merantau, like, I think it's about opportunity cost, right? Because like when the kind of like traditional idea is that like if a woman goes and travels away, what is the cost to her? Like, is it her, is it her childbearing years? Is it her children themselves? And with the Pontianak, like it's interesting because I think now there's a kind of like she's owning her liberation, right? She's kind of like a figure of like feminism now, and it's because she's like she's owning the fact that she lives outside of the bounds of patriarchy or outside of the bounds of society's norms, and I really like that because when we were talking about merantau, I was starting to feel a bit uncomfortable about the gendered aspect of it, which may not be intended, but is something to think about today, I think.
Yeah.
We have a question or a comment.
A comment.
In Half Craft, Half Art, Pak Latif mentioned that his mother and her siblings moved from Sumatra to Negeri Sembilan as their merantau. So sort of like kind of referring to the gendered merantau itself, whether if that is considered part of it. But Alfian, I think this also like backs to what you highlighted earlier, that the merantau is actually a circular migration, like in a sense. Yeah.
So I think with the Minang community, for example, I think it's quite well established. In Negeri Sembilan, there is a diasporic community there, right? So it's not. I mean, there will be people who will settle actually in Negeri Sembilan because there's like Minang town. In Malaysia at least, and then that's been going on for a while. So they are a diasporic community. So to rantau from Sumatra, West Sumatra to Negeri Sembilan isn't really that kind of circular migration. It's more settlement.
Yeah. Negeri Sembilan was always viewed as an extension of Sumatra. And actually, when Minang communities settled there, they chose a region in the valleys. Sri Menanti essentially is the point they arrived at, which is a valley between hills. And that was always seen as a projection of a further Sumatra. And there are other parts of not all of Negeri Sembilan is populated by Minangkabaus, of course. Although the entire political and administrative system of Negeri Sembilan follows the Sumatran model. But Alfian was very right. I mean, to speak of Pak Latif's mother's move to Sumatra as merantau is not quite accurate. It really was another return to another homeland, basically because it was seen as an extension of that entire Padang experience.
But I think that's kind of an interesting question, which is whether structurally or philosophically the merantau excludes the women's narrative, or whether it can sort of eventually be expanded. I mean, it's just a question. I'm wondering. There is an essay by Noel Salazar where he posits potentially labor migration today, particularly of women who work overseas, as a kind of merantau. So that's his provocation. But yeah, interesting.
Well, yeah. If you look at our other neighbors, the Philippines, many of the laborers who merantau are women. So many, and from other parts of Southeast Asia too, from Vietnam, many of the Vietnamese you find here, even the Burmese you find here, many of them are women. So there's definitely a narrative of merantau that is happening, but hasn't perhaps yet been maybe expressed.
But
merantau.
perhaps what doesn't qualify that as merantau are the economic structures that enforce it.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah.
Erica, do we have another?
Well, I think we have
I have gremlins in my
lots of care. Someone was sending lots of care and love.
That's sweet.
A fitting way to end this conversation.
Yeah. So I think on behalf of Erica and I'd just like to thank all of you for being here tonight, and of course our speakers as well for spending time with us online on a Thursday evening as well. Just a bit of repeating Erica's earlier announcement, which you might not have caught at the start of the program, is that this is all the other previous programs that are part of this online symposium will be made available as well later in terms of on our online platform. So please do come see the exhibition before it ends, and also if you're ever around the gallery, please come say hi. And if you have any other questions, please let us know as well. So thank you and good night.
Thank you.
Thank you all.
Have you got time for one more comment?
Thank you so much.
Just one more comment?
Yeah.
Sure.
Yeah.
As much as I love talking to all of you all, and I love you all very much, this is not real. See you next time. Thank you.
Tayangan.
See you in person next time.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Bye.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Bye.
Thank you. Bye-bye. Take care.
Yeah.
Thank you for joining us. Yeah. I think also one thing to add, if you're interested in more programs around this the topic, and also about the literature that Pak Latiff has always been very productive in and very instrumental in his work, you could also be looking at our other project that we did earlier this year called Poems of the Deep Night. So where I think Eddin Khoo, Pauline Fan, Ibrahim Tahir, as well as Alfian Sa'at has made readings and also translations of Latiff's poems. So thank you for joining us tonight. And any last words, Chinny?
Just thank you for joining us tonight. Yeah. Be good to see everybody in person.
Yes, please. Yeah.